Hi, I'm G, and in this video I'll be completing my expressive watercolour of some cherry tomatoes. So in my previous videos I was trying to paint expressively and get the colours right, so if you haven't seen those then there's links for video 1 and 2 below, and in this one I'm tackling the 3 S's: stalks, shadows and splatters. So first up, it's the stalks, and on my reference photo these were a really dark kind of green. So what I decided to do was blend cadmium yellow pale and Payne's grey again together to get a kind of a dark green, because one's a kind of bluey colour and one's a yellow, so I'm thinking blue and yellow together should give me a green. So I kick off with a size 3 brush and I mix and I test them in that top corner to make sure it's the kind of dark green that I need, and then I go straight in and I start putting the stalks in using this finer size 3 brush. Now I'm still trying to paint expressively and I don't want to be too fussy, so I know going down to a size 3 brush is quite, it's quite a fine brush, but as you can see these stalks and these kind of leaves are quite fine. So you might be looking at this and thinking, why is he not doing, confident single kind of strokes for these stalks? And that would be a really good idea. What I found when I'm doing a kind of single confident stroke is that it gets paler where I brush the paper to begin with, and then where I pick the brush up off the paper, it starts to get a kind of a pool of the darker color. So it's kind of uneven and it's lighter at the beginning and darker at the end. So what you can see me doing here is no other word to describe it, kind of fussy brush strokes where I'm just sort of gently almost dabbing the brush onto the paper again and again, just little strokes back and forth, joining up to each other, because what I'm finding there is a lot more of the paint is leaving the brush and is going onto the actual paper surface. So I'm getting a much more dark and also even color where I need it to be. Obviously I can change to make some of these stalks lighter if I need to by adding a bit of water, which is what you'll see me do over the course of painting this, but by doing these little I call them kind of little zizzing back and forth kind of strokes, I'm putting more paint, getting more paint out of the brush onto the paper and making it darker than perhaps if I did these lovely confident single strokes. Now as I start to join these two stalks at the top together, you can see that the first bit of paint that I put on at the very top of the stalk is too light. As it's dried you can see it's a lighter green, so I go back in with some of the green that I've got in the palette right there and I go over some of the bits I've already done, because I'm aware that this has got to be a really dark green, a really strong contrast, so I'm going to have to work at it perhaps with some second layers in places to make sure that these stalks are as dark green as they need to be. So it's at this point that I start to wonder, if I'm going to have to do some second layers on some of these green stalks here, have I mixed enough colour in the palette to be able to do them all in one go? Or is it going to be one of these where I run out of some colour halfway through and have to mix inevitably a second sort of batch of colour that's not going to be as close enough and the same colour as the first? But more on that later. Here you can see me colouring one of the stalks. I put a bit of colour at the very tip of the stalk, then I leave a gap and then I add some more colour. And that's because that part of the stalk that I've left, I want to be pale. So what I do is after I've painted it, I go and put the brush in some clean water, and I'm going to then just blend together those two darker bits of green with a little bit of clean water right here, right now. There you can see, just blending those together a bit gently with a bit of clean water so that they're still dark on the two ends, but they look as though they're gradually getting lighter in the center. Because not only does it look like that on the reference photo, but I don't want to paint all of the stalks the exact same flat green color, because that will kind of pull away from the depth that I've tried to give the cherry tomatoes underneath. So I've got to have some variation in the way that I do the stalks. They've got to have some light areas and some dark areas. And obviously I'm using the photo reference for that mainly, but also in my mind as I'm painting this, I'm thinking, well, the light source is coming in from the left-hand side. So, I can riff a little bit, I can make some little tweaks and some little changes that maybe aren't on the reference photo. I can improvise a little bit and just put in some little patches of lighter green on the stalks where I kind of figure there's going to be a bit of light hitting them. And when you would see the photo next to the painting, you'd be able to see those differences. But if you were just to see the painting on its own, you probably wouldn't know, and I could kind of bluff it, for want of a better term. And that brings me to a kind of another point as to why I'm actually doing the expressive painting and taking this expressive approach. Is because I often think that I'm a bit too much of a slave to the realism of the photo reference that I'm using. Usually when it's flowers and whatever, they're my own photos I've taken, and I want to do them as realistically as possible. And, you know, I'm just getting a little bit like, oh yeah, I can do that, you know, okay, but is it really what I want to do? And I do want to be able to paint a bit more expressively, where there's a looseness to my painting without them kind of slavishly copying the photo reference, and that you have a little bit more kind of artistic decisions to make, you know, and you can choose to make things darker, lighter, sploshier, and more expressive. So I am trying to do that, because I do feel as though perhaps myself, I tend to slavishly copy photos a little bit too much. And I love the realism angle, don't get me wrong, I love that, but I do want to be able to also paint in a much looser, expressive manner, because I do look at Instagram and all these other social media sites and follow a lot of watercolor artists who paint in this way, where it looks as though they've just thrown those colors on, thrown the water on, and yet it still looks like what it's supposed to. You can still pick out the kind of the forms and the basic idea of what the image is, but it's so much looser than what I usually do. So that's, you know, another reason why I'm trying to paint expressively, is to avoid the slavishly copying of a photograph. Now, as you see me painting this stalk and adding a little bit of the water that I've talked about to make some parts darker, some parts lighter, you should notice the palette that I'm just using, and a lot of that paint has disappeared. And I spoke earlier about how I was a little bit worried whether I'd be able to make what was in the palette cover what I needed it to cover. So at this point I'm worried a little bit. It's not the end of the world if I have to mix some more, but I always know it will be a different color. And here's where I break one of my kind of a rule, a fundamental of mine, and that is when I'm doing watercolor, and I always used to say this when I was teaching art as well, is always mix more color than you think you're going to need. Because oftentimes it would be trying to get students to, you know, paint a wash or a, you know, a big sky or whatever, and they'd only mix enough paint, and they, you know, stop halfway through. While they're mixing some more, they get a big dry line in the sky, and it's really frustrating. And that kind of thing can just put you off watercolor straight away. So what I'd say to them is always mix more color than you think you're going to need, and that's your sort of insurance policy then, to make sure you're definitely going to have enough color to cover whatever it is. And I haven't followed my very own kind of rule, my fundamental here, because I didn't mix enough of that dark green to fix it. And you can see me almost like the way that you scrape out a bowl when you are, you know, baking right now. I'm desperately trying to get into all the little edges and all the corners of that palette to, you know, try and get as much of that paint, you know, use up every single last ounce of it, so that I can try to just finish this all in kind of one pass without having to mix any more green. And inevitably that means that it's not going to be as dark here as it is at the top when I started, and I had the luxury of slapping on a lot more green. And what can I do? Mix some more? Yeah, sure I can. But also I'm looking at it and thinking, well, you know, maybe it's okay. Maybe it's good enough. I've got the green on there. You can see those stalks. That's going to be all right. I will let you guys be the judge. You can tell me in the comments below whether you think, oh, it looks fine, the stalks are okay, stop worrying, or yeah, you should have totally mixed a lot darker green to do that. Luckily, with this one down here, this cherry tomato on its own, I was able to have the luxury of mixing a complete new batch of that lovely dark green using the cadmium yellow pale and the Payne's grey. So that's what you can see me doing now in close-up, and I'm now applying that paint to this one, and again, using those slightly sort of little fussy, zizzy brush strokes as I try and, you know, make sure that there's all of that color going on there. But I don't have to worry so much because I've mixed a lot. You know, I've followed my fundamental this time, and I've mixed enough, more than I think I'm going to need. And also it's only one tomato that I've got to do. So I've got the luxury of having loads of paint here, and I can pop this on. And I think I've also actually mixed it a little bit darker than the original dark green that I did the other stalks with. So you can see me putting this on gently with the size 3 brush, and I'm kind of, some stalks I'm working from the outwards into the center, and then some I'm working from the center outwards to the, you know, very edge of the stroke. And this bit here I'm just trying to leave a little bit underneath to suggest not just the kind of leaves of the stalk, but the actual little bit of the stalk, you know, where it's been snipped, kind of that's sticking up, and that's why there's that kind of dash, that line in the middle. I'm just trying to make it a bit smaller here, just to suggest that sticking up and catching the light, so I'm not trying to put any dark color on that one. And there's just a little bit of time and the ability with that fine brush to add a little crease in that leaf there, just to give it a bit of extra detail without being too fussy. And then that one's done. So then I'm stepping back, I'm looking at it, and the next thing I needed to do was add more shadows. The shadows on the table weren't dark enough, so I mixed up some Payne's Grey, you can see in the palette there, and now I'm putting this on again with a size 3 brush, and I put on kind of pure colour, and then I dip the brush into the clean water, and I come back on, and I work it along the edge of where the colour is, then I dip the brush in again, and then I work it along the edge again. So what I'm doing is gradually making that Payne's Grey fade out as it works towards the rest of the painting. I also remember that they're tomatoes on a white table, so they're going to be some reflected light in the shadow. So that's what you can see me doing with the red there. I'm dipping my brush in the red and then blobbing a little bit in the Payne's Grey while it's still wet, so it floods out, and it's just giving this idea that, oh yeah, there's some of that lovely red tomato is reflected on the tabletop. And in this section here, I'm putting in quite a lot of Payne's Grey because, of course, it's two tomatoes squished together. So the shadow in between them is a lot stronger and it's a lot darker. So I'm trying to do that without using too much water to lighten it, because if I do that, it'll get too dilute and it'll get too pale. And also when I'm putting in the red that I drop in can't be too watery either, because again that'll have the effect of making it lighter and diluting it. So it's a bit of a balancing act here when I'm using the Payne's Grey and the red to try and make sure that when I plonk them on there and I drop the colours in, that they're not too watery, but of course I've also got to make them fade out in each of the sections. Now, talking of sections, putting in the stalks has actually done me a favour, because you can see that interior part of the table, here's a nice big close-up that I've got to put shadows on, is now split into these lovely little bite-sized kind of sections. So as long as I got the right consistency of paint and I'm using a nice thin brush, I can do these little sections one at a time without having to worry. Like when I'm doing a flower picture and I say that I can do them one petal at a time, and that makes it easier. Well, the fact that the stalks have split up this interior space here means it's a little bit easier for me to do these shadows, and it actually gives me quite a lot of confidence, because I know I'm not worrying about the entire space in one go. I can just do these little sections, and all I've really got to try and make sure is that they balance, across. So if I took the stalks away, would it be too patchy, a sort of like bunch of paints, or would they look as though they were actually, forming the same shadows and moving across into the same kind of areas? So that's the only sort of balancing bit that I've got to do. As you can see me again, just dropping in little bits of Payne's Grey where I think the edges of that Payne's Grey are too strong and too, harsh a line. I just get the brush and I put it in some clean water, and then I just work it along the edge of that Payne's Grey. And just keep working it, moving it outwards, dip the brush in water again and again, add that to it and move it out. So it's always getting paler the further away from the tomato the shadow gets, which is what I want. I want it to be strong near the tomato, but then getting lighter as it fades away, moves away from the tomatoes, because these shadows are not very hard edged. They're quite soft and diffuse kind of shadows, so they have to gradually change from dark to light, nothing too stark. And it's the same story with this little tomato, this one on its own, the runaway, the one that's getting clear of the pack. And this one has quite a strong kind of shadow around it, perhaps stronger than some of the others. So I can really go in and be quite, chunky and dark with the Payne's Grey here, and then get that clean water on that brush you can see there, and I just swirl it and sweep it around the edges, not too fussy, so that what it's doing is it's giving that Payne's Grey somewhere to flood into, but it's getting lighter the further away it goes. I drop in some red, and it's all looking okay, it's looking fine, but here's where I get a teeny bit fussy. I don't leave it. I should do, but I don't. And you see me come back in here and I try and blend the edge a little bit more with a bit of clean water, but I use too much. And what you should be able to see now is I'm creating what's going to be a bit of an uneven drying line, and that's bugging me, so I've got to fix this. So how I decide to do that is to go in with more water on the brush and basically re-wet that entire shadow, then go around the edge with the brush with clean water on, so I've made the edges of it kind of soft and diffuse again, but then go back into this sort of edge, where it meets the tomato, and drop in more Payne's Grey while it's all still moist and it's all still wet. Now, this is a bit of a gamble, didn't know whether this was definitely going to work, and actually as I drop in the red is not fluid enough, so it doesn't actually spread out as much as I wanted it to, but I just about get away with it, and I kind of made it work, brush a little bit here with the brush, smear a little bit here with my finger as well, but I've just about kind of rescued it. Now with these last few shadows on this right hand side, I can be quite loose and I can be quite bold, because I haven't got any stalks I've got to work inside and outside of, and I can just put on the Payne's Grey, I can put on the red, and I can then just, you know, sweep that brush around. And plus you've also got the added bonus of, now I've done a few of these shadows, I'm a little bit more confident, so I can work a little bit quicker and a little bit more expressively. So here you can just see me go on with quite a lot of lovely clean water on that brush and just sweep it around the edge of the Payne's grey, and you know, I get this lovely blend. Then I go in with a bit more clean water just to smooth out and fade out the edge a little bit, and that's it. I can leave that one done, you know, 2 or 3 brush strokes, done. You know, maximum expressiveness, least fussiness. And so I can do the same now with this shadow and then the final one just below it as well. I can just put on that Payne's grey, get the clean water on that brush, just blend the edge of it a little bit, blend a little bit more if it's too stark, if it's too strong like that bit, so I get a bit more on the brush and move it around. And then I can just move straight on to the next one. And that is the confidence that you get from having done this a couple of times and some of the other parts of the painting. So when you get to this, it's kind of plain sailing. And I know it sort of contradicts a little bit what I was saying about the middle bit, because the middle bit was broken into sections by the stalks, so I said it was easy because I could handle it, you know, a little bit at a time, bite size. And actually I'm telling you that, oh, this is kind of easy as well now, or easier, because I'm slapping on the paint and I'm then just blending it nice and kind of like loosely and quickly. So I suppose it's sort of, maybe it's contradictory, maybe there's like pros and cons to kind of both methods, I don't know. But by this point, I was happy with the shadows, I was happyish with the stalks. Now, if I look at the reference photo, you can see that there are kind of bits of what must be salt and pepper. So I thought I would do those by splattering them. So if I'm going to splatter, I need to mask off the important parts of my painting so they don't get splattered too. So I just decided to do that with a rough bit of printer paper, and you can see me just hand tearing the pieces, rough tearing the pieces to be my mask, and then I slap those down on top of the cherry tomatoes. So it's fairly rough, it's not too sort of fussy. Here I'm using a size 8, so a big fat brush, and I'm loading it with some very pale Payne's grey to start with. And you can see me tapping it against my hand here, just a couple of little gentle taps so that I get a sort of splattered effect, you know, where I can see it on the reference photo. I'm trying to put it on here, and you also see me vary the angle. So at first I was coming in from the bottom right and tapping it, as I am now, at the top right as well, but then I varied the angle at the bottom and tapped it so that it was spraying, you know, from the sort of bottom left upwards. So what I've done first of all as well is used a light Payne grey, so I've put on sort of a very light splatter first of all. Partly if it went bad it would be okay and it wouldn't show so much, but also so that I've got some variety in the splatters. So you can see me mixing some darker splatter here using Payne's grey and a bit of raw sienna. So I'm going to splatter these on top, so hopefully I'll get 2 different tones in the splatter. I'll get the light tones I put on first of all. Yeah, you can see I get a bit that I didn't quite want there. It's a bit too energetic a splatter, so that's why the grrr. But I'll also get some light areas and some dark areas within the splatter. So a bit of variety, which is very important. It's really what I wanted. And then when it's dried, you do the unmask. So you put a finger on the little bits to stop them shifting left and right, up or down, and smearing anything that might still be wet. And then you just lift off with your other fingers. And then ta-da, the big reveal. There it is, finished, my expressive painting of some cherry tomatoes. Please don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment below and like, and tell me what you thought about it all, and share as well. And there you go, you can see them side by side. You can see the reference photo and the tomatoes. So you can see I haven't slavishly copied the photo, and I've also, you know, done the colours a little bit lighter. They should be a bit darker. And in my next video, I continue my expressive watercolour journey with this picture of a stone sheep. So if you subscribe, you won't miss this one. Thanks for watching.